In the autumn of 1959, Troop 137 of the Boy Scouts of America held their weekly meetings in the basement of Bethany Lutheran Church in Alexandria, Virginia, just 8 miles from the heart of Washington, D.C. The meetings followed the same predictable rhythm every Thursday evening: the Pledge of Allegiance, the Scout, oath not tying demonstrations, merit badge requirements, and the closing circle, where 32 boys between the ages of 11 and 17 stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices blending into the familiar words about duty to God and country. For the parents waiting in the parking lot above, their station wagons idling in neat rows, these Thursday evenings represented the most ordinary expression of American suburban life. The scoutmaster, a man named Robert Belch, had led Troop 137 for nearly 3 years, and in that time he had earned a reputation as patient, knowledgeable, and remarkably dedicated to the principles Lord Baden-Powell had established half a century earlier. Robert Belch was 41 years old in 1959, a tall man with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic appearance. He worked as a technical translator, a profession that required him to sit at a desk in a small office in Georgetown, converting scientific papers from Russian and German into English. It was tedious work, poorly paid, and seemingly without ambition, exactly the kind of unremarkable career that would draw no attention, raise no questions, and provide perfect cover for a man who needed to appear invisible. Belch lived alone in a modest apartment on South Fairfax Street, drove a 7-year-old Plymouth, and spent his weekends preparing for scout meetings with a level of detail that impressed the parents who occasionally observed his work. He created elaborate camping itineraries, researched local flora and fauna for nature identification exercises, and maintained meticulous records of each boy's progress toward rank advancement. When parents asked him why he devoted so much time to the troop, Belch would smile gently and say that he had been scout himself as a boy in Pennsylvania, and that the values of scouting had shaped his entire life. But in the spring of 1960, a 15-year-old scout named Douglas Hemmings noticed something unusual during one of their Thursday evening meetings. Douglas was working toward his citizenship in the Nation Merit Badge, and Belch had been helping him prepare for the requirement that involved explaining the structure of the United States government. They were sitting at one of the folding tables in the church basement, and Belch had drawn a diagram showing the 3 branches of government, the system of checks and balances, the path of legislation through Congress. Douglas was taking notes in a small spiral-bound notebook when he happened to glance at Belch's hand as it moved across the paper. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its uniformity. But what caught Douglas's attention was that Belch was writing certain words, specifically the names of government agencies and military installations, with a slight hesitation, as if he were translating them in his mind before committing them to paper. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but Douglas had grown up with a father who worked for the State Department, and he had seen classified documents on his father's desk late at night. Something about the way Belch wrote reminded him of those documents. Douglas said nothing that evening, dismissing the observation as meaningless. But over the following weeks, he began to notice other small irregularities in Belch's behavior. During a camping trip to Shenandoah National Park in May 1960, Belch disappeared for nearly an hour, claiming he had gone to scout ahead for a better campsite. When Douglas and another scout went looking for him, they found Belch standing near the ranger station, apparently engaged in conversation with a man in civilian clothes who was holding what looked like a surveyor as equipment. The moment Belch saw the boys, he concluded the conversation abruptly and walked back toward the campsite with an expression Douglas would later describe as unsettled. During another meeting in June, Douglas overheard Belch speaking on the church's telephone in the hallway outside the basement. The conversation was brief, conducted in low tones, but Douglas distinctly heard Belch say the phrase Yankee Station, followed by a series of numbers. Douglas knew that Yankee Station was the informal name given to a United States Navy anchorage in the Gulf of Tonkin, because his father had mentioned it during dinner conversations about the deteriorating situation in Southeast Asia. By July 1960, Douglas Hemmings had accumulated enough strange observations that he felt compelled to mention them to his father. Richard Hemmings, a mid-level analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Richard Hemmings listened to his son's concerns with the patient skepticism of a professional intelligence officer who had spent 20 years evaluating the reliability of human sources. His initial assessment was that his son, an intelligent and observant boy, had allowed his imagination to construct a narrative from coincidental details. Robert Balch had been vetted by the Boy Scouts of America, had provided references, had submitted to the standard background review required of all adult volunteers working with children. There was nothing in his file to suggest anything beyond a middle-aged bachelor with an interest in youth development. But Richard Hemmings was also a man trained to recognize patterns, and something about his son's account, particularly the reference to Yankee Station, a detail no one outside military or intelligence circles should have been discussing in 1960, created a small but persistent doubt in his mind. What Douglas Hemmings did not know, what his father did not know, what none of the parents waiting in the parking lot of Bethany Lutheran Church could have known, was that Robert Balch was not Robert Balch. The man leading Troop 137 through their Thursday evening meetings was a Soviet intelligence officer named Rudolf Ivanovich Herman, a lieutenant in the KGB's first chief directorate, illegally resident in the United States since 1957. He had entered the country using a Canadian passport under the Balch identity, an elaborate legend that had been constructed over 3 years in Moscow and included genuine Canadian birth records, school transcripts, employment history, and even photographs showing a young Robert Balch at various stages of development. The real Robert Balch had died in a car accident near Thunder Bay, Ontario, in 1949, at the age of 17, and Soviet intelligence had harvested his identity the way a hermit crab claims an abandoned shell. The man who now lived in that identity had studied English since childhood, had been trained in American customs and idioms at a special KGB facility outside Moscow, and had been inserted into the United States with a specific operational mandate to establish himself as an invisible presence in the suburbs surrounding the nation's capital, to build a network of contacts, and to collect intelligence on military installations, government personnel, and defense contractors. The decision to become a scoutmaster had been Rudolf Herman's own innovation, a tactical choice that demonstrated the sophistication of his tradecraft. By volunteering to lead Troop 137, Herman gained access to a remarkable cross-section of Washington's professional class. The fathers of his scouts worked for the Pentagon, the State Department, defense contractors like Lockheed and Martin Marietta, research facilities involved in classified weapons development, and government agencies whose very names were restricted. These men would arrive on Thursday evenings to pick up their sons, and Herman would engage them in casual conversations about their work, their travel schedules, their concerns about the deteriorating relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The conversations were always light, friendly, seemingly innocent, exactly the kind of small talk that occurs naturally between adults supervising children. But Herman was trained to extract useful intelligence from such exchanges, to identify which fathers held security clearances, which ones traveled to sensitive locations, which ones expressed frustration with their careers or financial pressures that might make them vulnerable to recruitment. The Boy Scout meetings were not Herman's primary intelligence-gathering mechanism, but they provided valuable supplementary information, and more importantly, they gave him a reason to exist in Alexandria, a plausible explanation for his presence in the community. Richard Hemmings spent 3 weeks in August 1960 conducting what he would later describe as an informal background review of Robert Balch. He did not involve the FBI immediately, because doing so would have required him to file an official report, and he was not yet certain that his suspicions warranted such action. Instead, He used his access to State Department records to verify the basic facts of Balch's biography. The Canadian birth certificate was genuine, issued by the province of Ontario in 1918. The school records from Thunder Bay existed. The employment history as a technical translator checked out Balch worked for a small firm called Intercontinental Translation Services, which handled contracts for government agencies and private corporations. But as Hemmings dug deeper, he began to notice small inconsistencies that troubled him. Balch's Social Security number had been issued in 1955, relatively late for a man who claimed to have worked in the United States since the early 1950s. The references Balch had provided to the Boy Scouts of America were all from people who had known him for less than 5 years, and none of them could describe his life before 1955 in any detail. Most significantly, when Hemmings cross-referenced Balch's address on South Fairfax Street with utility records, he discovered that Balch paid his electric bill in cash every month, a practice unusual enough to warrant notation. On September 12, 1960, Richard Hemmings contacted a colleague at the FBI's Washington field office, a special agent named Thomas Garrett, who specialized in counterintelligence investigations. Hemmings presented his findings carefully, emphasizing that he had no direct evidence of espionage, only a pattern of anomalies that suggested Robert Balch might not be who he claimed to be. Garrett listened with professional interest, made notes, and promised to look into the matter. Within 48 hours, the FBI had opened a preliminary investigation into Robert Balch, assigning the case to cryptonym Boy Scout. The investigation began with physical surveillance. FBI agents established observation posts near Balch's apartment and began documenting his movements. What they observed over the following weeks was a life of almost aggressive normalcy. Balch went to work 5 days a week, stopped at the same grocery store every Saturday morning, attended Troop 137 meetings every Thursday evening, and rarely deviated from his routine. But the FBI agents conducting the surveillance were trained to look for patterns within patterns, and they noticed that once every 2 weeks, on Sunday afternoons, Balch would take a long walk that terminated at the Jefferson Memorial. He would stand near the statue for exactly 15 minutes, apparently reading the inscriptions on the walls, and then return home by a different route. The FBI recognized this pattern immediately. It was a surveillance detection route, a standard counterintelligence technique used to determine whether one is being followed. An innocent person visiting the Jefferson Memorial might stay for varying lengths of time, might sit on the steps, might take photographs. But Balch's visits were mechanically consistent, always 15 minutes, always alone, always followed by a circuitous return route that would expose any surveillance team attempting to follow him. The FBI began to suspect that these Sunday walks were not merely detection routes, but potential signal sites, locations where Balch might leave or receive communications from a handler. On October 9, 1960, FBI surveillance observed Balch place a small piece of white chalk on a specific section of the memorial's retaining wall. The mark was barely visible, easily dismissed as vandalism or accidental contact. But to trained counterintelligence officers, it was a classic signal, a message indicating that Balch had information to pass or needed to arrange a meeting. The FBI now faced a critical decision. They could continue passive surveillance, hoping to identify Balch's handler and map his intelligence network, or they could take more aggressive action by attempting to search his apartment, intercept his communications, or confront him directly. The decision was complicated by the fact that they still had no definitive proof that Balch was engaged in espionage. The FBI chose a middle path. They would intensify surveillance, monitor his communications, and attempt to establish the full scope of his activities before making arrests. On October 15, 1960, while Balch was at work, FBI agents entered his apartment on South Fairfax Street under the authority of a national security warrant. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions and revealed an operation far more sophisticated than they had anticipated. The apartment appeared, at first glance, to be exactly what one would expect from a middle-aged bachelor with modest means. The furniture was inexpensive, but well maintained. The bookshelves contained volumes on natural history, American geography, and Boy Scout leadership manuals. The kitchen was clean and organized. But FBI agents trained in counterintelligence search techniques noticed several anomalies. The sofa had been modified. The base had been reinforced with additional support structures that seemed unnecessarily heavy for the weight of the cushions. When agents removed the cushions, they discovered a hidden compartment containing a shortwave radio receiver, a one-time pad cipher system, and several rolls of undeveloped photographic film. The cipher system was Soviet standard issue, used by KGB illegals to decode messages transmitted through numerical stations, clandestine radio broadcasts that sent encrypted instructions to agents operating without diplomatic cover. The radio was tuned to specific frequencies known to be used by Soviet intelligence for communicating with assets in North America. But the most damning evidence was found in Balch's desk, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Boy Scout Handbook. Inside the book were 3 notebooks containing handwritten notes, all in English, documenting conversations Balch had conducted with the fathers of his scouts over the past 2 years. The notes were meticulously organized, with each entry dated and categorized by subject matter. One section contained detailed information about the work schedules of Pentagon employees, including notation about overseas travel and security clearance levels. Another section documented conversations about defense contracts, including specific references to missile guidance systems and satellite reconnaissance programs. A third section contained personal information about several of the fathers' financial problems, marital difficulties, drinking habits, exactly the kind of information an intelligence officer would collect to identify potential recruitment targets. The notebooks were not written in code, but they were structured in a way that suggested they were intended to be transcribed into reports for transmission to Moscow. The FBI agents photographed everything in the apartment, replaced the materials exactly as they had found them, and departed without leaving any trace of their presence. The investigation now escalated to the highest levels of the Bureau. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was personally briefed on the Boy Scout case, and the decision was made to continue surveillance while simultaneously investigating the fathers of Troop 137 to determine whether any of them had been successfully recruited or compromised. The investigation expanded to include wiretaps on Balch's telephone, mail intercepts, and continuous physical surveillance. What the FBI learned over the following weeks painted a picture of a highly disciplined intelligence officer operating with extraordinary patience and caution. Balch never made phone calls to suspicious numbers, never sent letters to addresses outside the United States, and never engaged in behavior that would attract attention. His tradecraft was so refined that without the initial tip from Richard Hemmings, he might have operated undetected for years. On November 18, 1960, FBI surveillance observed Balch engage in what appeared to be a brush-pass-a-brief, choreographed encounter designed to exchange materials without attracting attention. Balch was shopping at a hardware store in Arlington when he passed within inches of another man in the aisle. The encounter lasted less than 2 seconds, and to casual observers, it appeared to be nothing more than 2 customers navigating a narrow space. But FBI agents reviewing surveillance photographs noticed that Balch's right hand moved to his coat pocket at the exact moment of passing, and the other man's hand made an identical motion. The FBI now had visual evidence of a covert communication, but they still did not have enough to make arrests. They needed to catch Balch in the act of receiving or transmitting classified information, or they needed to identify his handler and determine the full extent of his network. The breakthrough came on December 3, 1960, when FBI cryptanalysts succeeded in partially decoding a message that had been transmitted on one of the shortwave frequencies associated with Soviet intelligence. The message, transmitted as a series of 5-digit numerical groups, referenced a meeting at a location identified only as the Park with the Generals. FBI analysts familiar with Washington geography recognized this as likely referring to Sheridan Circle, a small park in northwest Washington featuring an equestrian statue of General Philip Sheridan. The message indicated that the meeting would occur on December 10, 1960, at exactly 2 p.m. The FBI now had advanced knowledge of a planned encounter between Balch and his handler, an opportunity to observe both parties and potentially make arrests that would roll up an entire intelligence network. On the morning of December 10, 1960, FBI surveillance teams took up positions around Sheridan Circle, concealed in parked vehicles, behind the windows of nearby buildings, and among the pedestrians walking through the park. The operation involved more than 40 agents, coordinated through radio communications and guided by detailed operational plans that had been rehearsed over the previous week. The FBI's objective was to observe the meeting, identify Balch's handler, and arrest both men in the act of exchanging classified materials. At 1:47 p.m., Robert Balch arrived at Sheridan Circle on foot, having walked from a bus stop 6 blocks away. He carried a folded newspaper in his left hand and wore a dark overcoat despite the mild weather. He sat on a bench facing the statue and appeared to read his newspaper, occasionally glancing at his watch. At exactly 2 p.m., a second man entered the park from Massachusetts Avenue. He was approximately 50 years old, heavy-set, wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. FBI agents would later identify him as Pavel Mikhailovich Doronin, an attaché at the Soviet embassy with diplomatic immunity and a known KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover. Doronin walked past Balch's bench without acknowledgement, paused briefly to examine the statue, and then sat on a second bench approximately 30 feet away. For several minutes, neither man moved or acknowledged the other's presence. Then, at 2:04 p.m., Doronin stood, walked toward the edge of the park, and stopped to tie his shoe near a waste receptacle. As he bent down, he placed his briefcase on the ground. Balch, who had been watching from his bench, folded his newspaper, stood, and walked toward the same waste receptacle. As he passed Doronin, he bent down as if to tie his own shoe, and in that moment, the briefcases were exchanged. The FBI moved immediately. Agents converged from multiple directions, surrounding both men before either could react. Balch was arrested first, at 2:06 p.m., by agents who identified themselves and ordered him to place his hands on his head. He complied without resistance, his face betraying no emotion beyond what witnesses later described as resignation. Doronin attempted to assert diplomatic immunity, but the FBI agents informed him that he was being detained for questioning in connection with espionage activities, and that his diplomatic status would be addressed through appropriate channels. Both men were transported to FBI headquarters in separate vehicles, and the briefcases were immediately secured as evidence. The briefcase Balch had been carrying contained microfilm copies of documents he had photographed over the previous 6 months. The documents included training manuals from defense contractors, travel schedules of State Department personnel, organizational charts showing the structure of Pentagon offices, and detailed notes about military installations in the Washington area. None of the documents were classified at the level that would constitute the most serious espionage, but their aggregate value to Soviet military intelligence was considerable. The briefcase that had belonged to Doronin contained $10,000 in cash, a new one-time pad cipher system, and instructions for Balch's next assignment, a directive to focus his collection efforts on fathers who worked at the National Security Agency's new facility at Fort Meade, Maryland. At FBI headquarters, Rudolf Herman, the man who had lived as Robert Balch for more than 3 years, was interrogated for 16 hours over 2 days. He refused to cooperate initially, providing only his cover name and date of birth, but as FBI interrogators confronted him with the evidence recovered from his apartment, and the contents of the briefcases, his resistance gradually eroded. On December 12, 1960, Herman admitted his true identity and acknowledged that he was an officer in the KGB as First Chief Directorate. He described his training, his insertion into the United States, and his operational activities, though he refused to identify other Soviet agents or provide information that would compromise ongoing operations. His interrogation revealed the sophisticated nature of KGB illegal programs officers who operated without diplomatic protection, who built elaborate cover identities, and who collected intelligence through patient, methodical cultivation of sources over many years. The immediate aftermath of Herman S. arrest sent shockwaves through Troop 137 and the families who had trusted him. Parents who had allowed their sons to go on camping trips, supervised by Herman, who had invited him into their homes, who had shared personal information during casual conversations, now confronted the reality that they had been targeted by a hostile intelligence service. The FBI conducted interviews with every family associated with the troop, seeking to determine whether any classified information had been compromised and whether any of the fathers had been successfully recruited. The investigation concluded that while Herman had collected significant amounts of information about government personnel and their activities, he had not succeeded in recruiting any agents, and none of the fathers had knowingly provided classified material. But the psychological damage was profound. Several families left the Washington area entirely, relocating to other parts of the country. Others withdrew from community activities, no longer trusting their neighbors or colleagues. Douglas Hemmings, the 15-year-old scout whose observations had triggered the investigation, would later say that the experience had taught him that the world was far more dangerous and deceptive than he had understood. Pavel Doronin was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States on December 15, 1960, along with two other Soviet embassy officials whom the FBI suspected of involvement in Herman's network. The Soviet government issued a formal protest claiming that the arrests were provocations designed to damage U.S.-Soviet relations, and Moscow denied that Herman was a Soviet intelligence officer, claiming he was a Canadian translator who had been falsely accused. But privately, Soviet intelligence recognized that the Herman operation had been compromised beyond recovery, and the KGB withdrew several other illegals from the United States and Canada as a precautionary measure, concerned that Herman's arrest might lead to additional exposures. Rudolf Herman was indicted on multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage in January 1961. He was tried in federal court in Washington, D.C. in May 1961, in proceedings that were partially closed to protect classified information about FBI counterintelligence methods. Herman pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence that would allow the possibility of parole. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He served 18 years before being released in 1979 as part of a prisoner exchange traded to the Soviet Union in return for two American businessmen who had been arrested in Moscow on fabricated charges. Upon his return to the Soviet Union, Herman was quietly retired from the KGB with the rank of colonel and given a modest pension. He lived in Moscow until his death in 1997, having never spoken publicly about his years as Robert Balch. For Troop 137 of the Boy Scouts of America, the aftermath was a slow process of recovery and rebuilding. The troop continued to meet at Bethany Lutheran Church under new leadership with enhanced background screening procedures for all adult volunteers. But the fathers who had known Herman, who had shaken his hand and trusted him with their sons, carried with them a permanent wariness, a recognition that the Cold War was not an abstract geopolitical struggle, but a conflict that reached into the most intimate spaces of their lives. They had learned that the enemy did not always announce itself with tanks and missiles, but sometimes arrived disguised as a patient, dedicated scoutmaster who taught their sons how to tie knots and recite the Scout Oath. The case of Rudolf Herman, the spy who infiltrated the Boy Scouts, represented a particular strain of Cold War espionage, not the dramatic defections or spectacular acts of sabotage that captured headlines, but the quiet, methodical work of intelligence officers who embedded themselves in ordinary communities and collected information through ordinary relationships. Herman had not stolen nuclear secrets or compromised military operations. He had simply talked to fathers at scout meetings, listened to their complaints about work, noted their travel schedules, and transmitted those observations to Moscow. In the aggregate, his reporting contributed to Soviet intelligence assessments of American military capabilities, defense spending priorities, and the psychological state of government employees during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The damage he inflicted was diffuse and impossible to quantify precisely, but it was real. The Herman case also revealed the moral complexity that characterized so much of Cold War espionage. Rudolf Herman was, by all accounts, a dedicated intelligence officer serving his country. He had undergone years of training, accepted a dangerous assignment, lived a false identity for years, and endured separation from his family and homeland in service to what he believed was a just cause. The fathers of Troop 137 were equally dedicated Americans, working in government and defense to protect their country from what they perceived as Soviet threats. Both sides believed they were acting righteously. Both sides collected intelligence on the other. Both sides recruited agents and built networks and justified their actions through appeals to national security and ideological necessity. The boys caught between them, the scouts who learned their knots from a Soviet intelligence officer, were the true casualties, their innocence sacrificed to a conflict they did not choose and could not fully understand. In the decades since Rudolf Herman's arrest, the case has faded from public memory, remembered primarily by historians of intelligence and former FBI agents who worked counterintelligence during the Cold War. But for the families of Troop 137, for Douglas Hemmings, who noticed the anomaly that unraveled Herman's cover, for the FBI agents who spent months conducting surveillance in the shadows, the case remains a reminder of how the Cold War infiltrated every level of American society, how it turned neighbors into potential threats and ordinary institutions into targets for penetration. The Thursday evening scout meetings at Bethany Lutheran Church continued, season after season, year after year, but they were never quite the same. The parents waiting in the parking lot above understood now what they had not understood before that in the Cold War. Nowhere was truly safe. No one was entirely beyond suspicion, and the man teaching their sons about citizenship might be reporting to Moscow.